Welcome to C2GTalk, a series of one-on-one interviews with influential practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges raised by emerging approaches to alter the climate. I am Mark Turner, Senior Communications Consultant with C2G, and I'm speaking today with Inés Camilloni, a professor in atmospheric sciences at the University of Buenos Aires, who was recently appointed as Vice Chair of the IPCC's Working Group 1, which explores the physical science basis of climate change. Over recent years, Professor Camilloni has become an increasingly prominent public speaker on climate issues, including on the science and governance of solar radiation modification, also known as solar geoengineering. Her team in Argentina is researching the regional and local effects that SRM could have on the hydroclimate of the La Plata Basin, which is the fourth largest drainage basin in the world and home to more than 160 million people. Prof. Camilloni was also a co-author of this year's independent expert review under the UN Environment Programme on solar radiation modification research and contributed to a UNESCO report on the ethics of climate geoengineering. In late 2022, she called for more research into the challenges around SRM in a talk at TEDx Rio de la Plata called Solar Geoengineering, Who Controls the Earth's Thermostat? Inés Camilloni, welcome to C2GTalk.
Thank you very much.
Great. Well, let's start with congratulations on your recent appointment as Vice Chair of the IPCC. Can you tell us a little bit about what your work there will entail?
Well, to be Vice Chair of the IPCC has a role to work together with the co-chairs of the IPCC, and also as a member of the Bureau of the IPCC, we have to prepare the work plan for the 7th assessment cycle that it's just beginning. And also we have to work close with the authors to advise them, to train them in some issues related to uncertainties, how we manage uncertainties, for example, in the IPCC, and to be also in all the approval sessions of the reports, and also to be part of the selection of authors and researchers to be part of the scoping meetings in the preparation of the reports. So it's a very active role for the next 7 years.
So what do you see as the big challenges to be addressed by the IPCC in this 7th assessment cycle? What are the big themes that we're looking at? We know a lot already about what's happening with the climate. What more do we need to know?
I think that one of the big things we should do is to produce more concise reports. The last 6 assessment report of the Working Group 1 weighs more than 6 kilograms in the printed versions of this. There are 2 volumes. It's really a very hard task to read all this information. And it's good maybe for the scientific community, but we want to produce, I think we should produce something more concise, more readable than what is now. And the other issue is that up to now, the idea is that the IPCC should be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. But there's an increasing need of proposing solutions. And there's some kind of overlapping with this idea of saying what we can do, what we should do, and not being prescriptive. So I think this is something that we should discuss more, because I think that it's also something that everybody wants to have the IPCC with a stronger voice, not only in scientific issues, but also in the messages about the urgency, about what it must be done during the next years.
Well, that's fascinating. I know there's a lot of debate around this, so I really look forward to seeing how that evolves.
Yes.
So let's turn to your work on solar radiation modification, which is obviously something that C2G is very interested in. First of all, just on a simple level, what is it, and what attracted you to work on this idea?
Well, maybe I will start answering the second question.
Okay.
I've been lead author of the IPCC 1.5 report in the impacts and risk assessment chapter. And one of the results that came from that report was that to reach the 1.5 target, temperature target, we should reduce in a very dramatic way the carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere. And the number was really frightening because we should reduce more than 40% compared to the emissions in 2010. And in this chapter about impacts and risks, we showed that half a degree between 1.5 and 2 degrees show a very relevant risk, increasing risk associated to this half a degree. So the urgent to reduce these emissions into the atmosphere was really something very important. And when I saw these numbers and what we are doing now that emissions are still increasing, I start listening to this idea about solar engineering or climate engineering or climate intervention, that there was something else in this menu of strategies that we can consider when we talk about the solution space about climate change. And in particular in the Global South or in Latin America, nobody was talking about this. And I decided that we should have local information, we should know more about the potential impacts, because with that numbers in mind, it seems sometimes that we are going into that direction if we want to avoid the worst risk of climate change.
Okay, and we'll definitely talk a little bit in a little bit about the Global South and its involvement in this research. But let's, if we could sort of take stepping back. First of all, maybe we'll address what are the big issues raised by SRM, and also how do we actually talk about it and analyze it? It's a potential method to reduce climate risk, but it creates potentially new risks of its own. How can scientists analyze and communicate these two different risks and balance them out, especially given uncertainty, which we touched on earlier, and things we know we don't know and things we don't know we don't know?
Yes, the first thing is to identify what we really don't know yet, to identify the risk for different regions, different sectors. And also we need to keep in mind that there are different strategies of solar radiation modification, including introducing aerosols into the stratosphere, but marine cloud brightening, and also cirrus cloud thinning, or changing the albedo of the surface. There are different strategies, and the effect or the potential consequences of each of these strategies are really different. So the first thing is to identify which strategy for what. We want to cool the whole planet, we want to cool some area or protect some region from increasing temperatures, and for this we can use, for example, marine cloud brightening. If we want to cool the whole planet, maybe we should think in stratospheric aerosol injection. So there's not a single question because it depends on the strategy. And even when we consider stratospheric aerosol injection, for example, if we want to cool the planet by 1 degree or by half a degree, or for how long. So the potential risks are really completely different depending on the strategy. So this is the first thing that we should keep in mind. And the other thing is, considering the different strategies, what are the potential risks associated to each of them? And then to compare this potential risk with the risk of a planet that is becoming warmer and warmer and in unprecedented and very dangerous way. So maybe the the best tool we have up to now to analyze this issue is to compare the risk of a warming planet against the risk of solar radiation modification under these different strategies that we can think about.
Great, and I'm really glad actually you raised the different kinds of approaches, because sometimes I get a sense that in articles or in the public discourse, people just say geoengineering as though it's one thing, but of course it could be lots of different things. Do you think that, and similarly in sort of comparing, as you say, this risk of SRM against the risks of a warming world, do you think the public debate is understanding these nuances, or are we really very much only at the beginning of how you actually go about explaining that? And do you think people are ready to engage with this sort of more nuanced, complex way of understanding what you're looking at?
No, I think it's really to really understand. We are trying to produce information about this risk framework that we think it's the best way to really understand the potential impacts of SRM and to compare with the climate change, and maybe it's the best tool we have to make a decision about if it's a good or a bad idea, or something that we still need to know more to make a decision. But I am sure that it's not easy to understand this, because we have many uncertainties, and we need to make more research to really have more information about this potential risk of SRM. We know more about the risk of climate change, but not so much about the risk of SRM.
Right. So maybe we just take one specific example and your work in La Plata. Can you tell us how you see from your work the comparative risks of climate change on the region and the use of SRM in this hotter world in the region?
We identify, for example, some benefits, a reduction in temperature and in the extreme temperatures in the basin. And this is really good because we have a megacity as Buenos Aires within the basin, and lots of people living there and many economic activities. So extreme temperature, it's really something dangerous for people and also for ecosystems and for economic activity. But the other thing is that we also explore potential changes in precipitation and in river flows. And what we found is that we can expect a reduction of extreme precipitation and also changes in river flows. For example, less frequent low flows, and this could be really also a good or a positive consequence of SRM. But we also found, for example, an increase of extreme flows. This means high flows that could lead more frequently to floods. So for the same region, we can expect some good results, some bad results, but always compared to a high emission scenario. So this is the first step to explore the potential impacts of solar radiation modification in La Plata Basin. We need more research, but at least with these results, we have this situation, some benefits and some increase in risk in other parts of the basin, for example.
And we'll talk a little bit later about how policymakers might use that kind of information. We touched on the need for more. You said you're inspired by the need to learn more about how it would affect your region, and in general, how important do you think it is for scientists across the global South, Latin America, the Caribbean, and beyond, in other regions, to get involved in SRM research, and how much do you see that happening right now?
I think it's really very important to have scientists from the global South being part of the conversation and doing research on SRM, because the strategy of introducing aerosols into the stratosphere, stratospheric aerosol injection, can change the global climate. not only at the regional scale, but on a global scale. So we must be part of this conversation, because we are talking about the technology that can produce changes in different regions, and there's a need of a governance structure in that sense. And when we talk that we need a governance structure, we need our governments, the governments of the different countries in the Global South, to be part of the conversation and to have information produced by local researchers. So I think it's really relevant, and because we have the resources, the human resources to do this research.
Yeah, I believe you received some funding for your work from the Degrees Initiative. What other kind of support is out there? How much is funding a challenge for the Global South and scientists who would want to study this, given all the other things that could be funded? And also, maybe we could touch on some other challenges in terms of access to computing, or access to, the right conferences and the right experts in the right places. I'd love to learn a little bit more about what challenges you see facing potential Global South researchers on SRM.
Well, funding is really an issue for research in the Global South, because as you mentioned, there's lots of things that we need to know more in our regions, including climate change. And to have funding from degrees, it's really very relevant. It was my starting point to do research on SRM. And after that, I received funding from a national agency of Argentina, and this is really important, the support of an agency from my country to do this research. But anyway, funding is limited when we think that we need more computing, when we need to be part of different events, and also to publish our research in journals that they are usually very, very expensive. So in that sense, we need more funding. Of course, degrees was this starting point, but maybe larger funding from different agencies, it's good. And in this sense, degrees also help the Global South scientists for networking with scientists from the Global North, and this South-North cooperation, and also the South-South cooperation. But in the North-South cooperation, it's really good, because it, in some way, it opens us the doors to different funding and to cooperation to researchers from different institutions.
SRM is pretty controversial, especially perhaps in the north. And I wonder to what extent some of the opposition increasingly expressed, including by NGOs and scientists and various others to SRM, and all the accusations they say, oh, this is, moving things away from what we should be doing, this is unnatural, all the various accusations. How much does that weigh on scientists? How much of that is a problem? How much does that put scientists off from doing this work? I'd be really interested in how you've experienced that, especially perhaps from your experience in Latin America, where I've certainly seen a lot of skepticism expressed.
Yes, it's not easy. Not because other scientists are saying you should not be studying the potential impacts of SRM in this region, but maybe more from NGOs or from people that really don't understand what's the meaning of our research and why we are doing this. It's sometimes it's not a very comfortable situation, but I think we can manage. And the very strong idea is that what we are doing is to explore and try to understand the potential impacts. We are not saying we should do this, but what we are saying is, if somebody is going to do this, this is what could happen in this region. So in that sense, I think we can manage the situation, and we have the support of the the National Research Agency for
And
this,
when
and
you,
this is really very important.
and when you face criticism and then you explain it in the way you just explain it, I'm not saying we should do this. I'm saying that we need to know what would happen in our area if someone did it. Do you find that that is something the critics accept, that makes them think, oh, okay, that's a good point? Are you seeing that people are meeting you on this?
Sometimes yes, and sometimes no, because there are some radical positions related to this, and they associate the solar engineering with the chemtrails and what they see in the sky, and it's difficult to convince people this is not geoengineering, this is not happening yet, and this is something different. And well, but in that sense, it's easier to talk to other scientists, not so easy to talk maybe to general public that don't have a scientific understanding on the atmosphere and the different climate processes.
So let's move on to some of the UN processes. You were one of the co-authors of UNEP's One Atmosphere report, or independent expert review. Notably, it stated SRM is the only option that could cool the planet within years, which is quite a bold statement, but also said an operational SRM deployment would introduce new risks to people and ecosystems. So perhaps you could take me through what you see as the report's main recommendations, and also talk a little bit about the reaction to that report.
The recommendations are that, of course, mitigation is the most important climate action. We must reduce the CO2 emissions into the atmosphere, and also adaptation. It's relevant when we consider climate action. But in some way, we are not on track to limit the global warming under 1.5 degrees. So we need more research about these technologies. We don't know enough to decide now. And we identified that there are some benefits, for example, cooling the planet, but there are also some risks. And these risks are in some way associated to the, for example, uneven distribution of the cooling effect. For example, it could be a technology that could be over effective in some regions, and it may cool the region more than what is needed, and in other regions it could be, for example, not enough, and it will create a new climate, and we don't know really enough how this new climate could be in terms of the consequences of this, because it's not like a time machine going back to a previous climate that we already know. So we need to understand more about this risk. We have little understanding about the potential effects on human health, for example, on ecosystems, and water availability in different regions. We have something about La Plata Basin, but there are many really important basins around the world that we need to understand more. So in that sense, is that these new risks, we don't know them yet, and we need more research. And talking about research, this report also mentions that we need governance of research, and
Right.
there are different levels for this governance of research. For the small scale research, the research that we usually do with our computer simulations, what we call the indoor research, we don't think, at least, that we need a governance structure for that, because there are codes of conduct of researchers and academic freedom related to this. So in that sense, that's not necessary. But when we talk about outdoor research, even for small scale outdoor research, there was not a full agreement within the group of authors of this report. And one of the idea is that maybe the outdoor research could accelerate the deployment of this technology, what it's called the slippery slope idea. So there are different levels of discussion, and obviously at the end, if this is going to be used in an operational way, we really need a governance structure. But what was really identified is that we need the governance of the stratosphere. For example, when we think about introducing aerosols into the atmosphere. So these are some of the discussions involved and part of this report.
And where might some of that governance take place? What bodies were suggested where that governance could happen?
We don't really know, but it seems that UN is in a good position to be part of this governance structure because it has the experience of working with all countries, but maybe this is something that it should be discussed. But at the beginning, for example, UN would be in a good position to start.
Do you think the IPCC should be addressing SRM in more detail? If so, how, where?
Solar radiation modification is part of the report. In the sixth assessment report, there's a very large section related to this. But scenarios considering SRM are not at the end part of the large assessment of the potential or the possible scenarios. I think this is a step that should be discussed. I don't know what will happen, but I think it would be good if, considering the different SSPs or the different scenarios with different emissions of greenhouse gases, also these kind of scenarios should be part of the same group of scenarios being discussed in the report.
And the SSPs,
but this is a personal idea. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and the SSPs being the socio-economic pathways, is that it?
Yes, that's right. The socio-economic pathways that were used in the last cycle of IPCC.
Right. Now, most recently, UNESCO's World Commission on the Ethics of Scientific Knowledge and Technology issued a report on the ethics of climate engineering,
yes.
And it called for the formulation of ethical values and principles. What might that look like in practice?
Well, there are 6 issues that should be considered related to the ethics of climate engineering. And in this point, I want to mention that this report refers not only to solar radiation modification, but it also includes carbon dioxide removal. So the different issues related to the ethics in the first place is the governance. When we are talking about changing the global climate, we need this governance structure, and also participation. We need everybody to be part of this kind of conversation, including the global south and different groups, indigenous people, women, young people. And also there's a strong role of the scientific knowledge and the scientific community to be part of this conversation, because we need to produce more information, we need more research, and we need researchers both from the physical sciences but also from the social science to be involved in this conversation. We need to strengthen capacity. The capacity building is another issue. We need more researchers in the different areas in this conversation. We also need education, because we need to communicate what we know and what we do not know, and the potential risks and the potential benefits that this technology may have. And the last point was related to the awareness and how UNESCO could lead in some way the discussion about the ethics of the potential deployment of this technology.
One thing that interests me about the ethics is sometimes you're having a conversation between 2 people about SRM, and you're realizing you're not connecting somehow. And the moment comes sometimes when you realize, oh, we're using different ethical frameworks here. Let's say one person is using a framework of how to have the least suffering, you know, for the most amount of people. And that's my measure of whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. Somebody else might be more driven by red lines. You know, these are lines over which you cannot cross, whether religious or, you know, to do with Mother Earth or whatever. How do you deal in conversations when people are coming at this from such different ethical frameworks, from such different ways of analyzing the world?
It's not easy, and it was hard during the preparation even of this report, this draft report at this stage, because of this, because we have people coming from different sciences and living in different regions, and the perception of climate change is also different from each other. But I think that this last year, the extreme precipitation and temperature events and the scale of these unprecedented events in some way is moving the line to a discussion that is, can we be able to live everywhere in this planet, or some places are really going to a climate that nobody could live in that place because of the extreme temperatures, for example. And I think that in that sense, the unprecedented changes we are seeing in the climate during the last months is moving the discussion to the idea that there's really an emergency. And maybe it's not the time right now to deploy these technologies. And even if we want, we cannot do it at the global scale. But it's time to think about, to do more research, and in some case to have this ready in case we really need to use them this generation or the next generation, because we are not on track to live to the globe to the next generations in a very good way.
Well, there's so much more I'd love to talk to you about misinformation, about the state of the science. We could talk for a lot longer, but I realize we're kind of reaching the end of this. So perhaps maybe I could ask a final question on a more personal level. I mean, the very fact we're discussing this idea, SRM, stratospheric aerosol injection, I mean, it really shows that we're really in a very serious predicament. No one would consider this if we weren't. And I guess, especially given you know, the confusion out there and often misinformation and so forth, it can be difficult as a scientist to stay optimistic, motivated, especially given the scale and the complexity of the problem and the apparent reluctance for powerful interests to get involved in solving it. How do you get through that? How do you find motivation? Where do you get a sense of hope and energy from?
I think that the motivation is that maybe we have this technology that can help us to avoid the most dangerous aspects of climate change, to avoid the overshoot or to reduce the overshoot for some time. And we can in some way buy some time until we can really reduce the emissions. So I think this is what motivates me, that maybe there's a temporary solution. It's not the best solution probably, but maybe there's something there that can avoid the worst of climate change.
So do you have a fundamental optimism in and faith in human ingenuity to be able to work out its problems?
I think that we know the problem. We know that humanity is responsible of the problem of climate change. We know the solutions, and it's the phase out of fossil fuels, but we are not doing that in the way and in the velocity that we need. So what we have now is at least this chance of maybe that technology can help us for some time. And when you have kids and you want them to live in a better place, I think we have the obligation to be in some way optimistic.
Inés Camilloni, thank you so much for taking part in this C2G talk. It was really, really good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.